You're listening to episode 147, Conquering PTSD and Taking Your Power Back with Michele Rosenthal. Welcome to the Grass Gets Greener podcast, the show for survivors by survivors. I'm your host, Melissa Wilson, a bullying survivor and anti-bullying advocate. And each week you'll hear from a survivor who has overcome a traumatic experience to go on to not only survive, but thrive, so that you can too, starting now. Hey there, welcome, and thank you so much for tuning into this latest episode of the podcast. I'm so grateful to have you here. And we're going to be joined today by Michele Rosenthal of HealMyPTSD.com and MyTraumaRecoveryCoach.com. Before we get into it, I do just want to let you know that this episode is sponsored by Navni. Navni is the top-ranked anonymous rating website in the world. Navni provides free wellness resources and low-cost online therapy services to help people cope with various levels of emotional distress. Write anonymously. Feel better at novni.com. So Michele is an award-winning blogger, speaker, trauma recovery specialist, and PTSD expert, as well as a survivor. And she joins us today to talk about how she's been able to reclaim her identity and find joy again after suffering from PTSD symptoms for almost 30 years. In particular, she's going to talk about how she had a rare adverse reaction to a medication when she was 13 years old, where she essentially became a full-body burn victim, and how she struggled with PTSD for almost 30 years as a result. And she'll talk about how she was initially affected after her illness, and how trauma impacts our belief systems. And she'll share with us how therapy didn't work for her initially, and what it took for her to commit to her healing work, which has ultimately led to her being 100% symptom-free. And she'll talk about how everyone is capable of healing, and how doing healing work actually accumulates over time, and the importance of pacing yourself in recovery. And she'll talk about why it was important for her to find ways to heal without having to talk about the trauma. And she'll share the story of how the turning point in her recovery occurred on a dance floor, and how you're not failing in your healing work if you still have days where you struggle, and how our failures can lead to breakthroughs. And she'll also share with us how she started doing the work that she does now, helping other survivors. So lots of great stuff talked about here today, and this is going to be a good episode for you to listen to regardless of whatever type of trauma background you may be coming from. And so without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into this one, and I'll go bring Michele on. Michele, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me here today to share your story with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here today to share your incredible journey with us. I know that your story is going to inspire those listening and give them hope for whatever trauma they may be healing from. And on your website, you say that your passion is guiding survivors to release post-trauma symptoms and reclaim their lives so they can be happy, healthy, productive, and joyful. And I love that. And, you and I are both passionate about using our past experiences and what we've learned in our own healing journeys to guide others in their healing. And I think we'll talk a lot about the healing aspect today and what it looks like to create your life after trauma. And Michele, what I like to do is, first have you start us out by sharing with us a summary of the trauma that you experienced so that we have that context, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds so logical. So thank you for that direction. Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
absolutely. So, just, take a few minutes and share with us what you'd like us to know about your experience.
Okay, absolutely. I will give you the bottom line short version of it so that we can just all start from the same place together. So at the age of 13, I survived a very rare adverse allergic reaction to a medication that I had been given. And this happens to 1 in 2 million people. So when I'm about to tell you, don't anybody worry that it's going to happen to you, because it is really that rare. But I had a run-of-the-mill infection and took an antibiotic that the doctor gave me and had anything but a run-of-the-mill reaction to it. Essentially, my body could not metabolize the antibiotic. And so in order to get rid of it, since it couldn't metabolize it and digest it, it sent it out through the skin. So essentially I became a full body burn victim, head to toe. And today when this happens to people, they immediately put them into a coma. But this was 1981. Nobody understood what was happening to me. None of the doctors in New York City where I was had ever seen it. And so I was awake and conscious and in an excruciating, terrifying, indescribable pain for the next weeks.
That sounds awful.
Yeah, it was pretty awful and pretty gruesome. And I was in a burn unit, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So you just have to sort of wait it out. And while I was there, the mortality rate for this is very high. I actually had a near-death experience. And the only reason that I bring that up is because by the time I walked out of the hospital, I knew that I was going to make a full physical recovery. But you put together the severity of the horror of what had happened to me, to go from being totally fine, a totally normal 13-year-old kid, to this full body burn victim surrounded by medical professionals and adults who'd had no clue how to help me. That in itself just destroyed my whole view of the world as being a safe place. And then you add onto it this near-death experience where I had no way and no one and no Google, which would have been really helpful. There was no way for me to understand where I had gone. I knew that I had been someplace else. I had vivid memories of it. I still do. But at that time, I had no context for understanding. And so I came out of the hospital knowing that I was going to make a full physical recovery. I've got scarring, whatever, but I'm fine. That was my thought. But I also knew I'm a totally different person. Just hands down. And right away, Melissa, it was impossible for me to think about what had happened, to talk about what had happened, to go anywhere near any of those details, because it so overwhelmed me emotionally. My ability to cope was non-existent.
Mm-hmm. And something that just happened out of the blue too.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And back then in 1981, let's put some historical context to this. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, became a diagnosis, a real diagnosis, in 1980. It was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's used for diagnosis. And it was really only being applied to Vietnam veterans. So in 1981, when there's this kid with this civilian kid with a medical trauma, nobody understood the symptoms that I started to exhibit and put them together with what it meant.
PTSD wasn't even on the radar for you at that point.
No, you're so right. It took 24 years for me to be diagnosed. So needless to say, things went downhill from there.
Yeah.
But that's the short version of how I ended up with PTSD for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And the sad part is, with all that you and I know now, oh my gosh, and this is my mission. It's to help people heal faster than I did, so that they have the education and the knowledge and the awareness and the protocol to move forward. And there is no reason to lose essentially a third of my life to something that was totally diagnosable and treatable. Doing what you're doing and spreading the word and raising awareness and giving education and knowledge so that people can reclaim their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, that just sounds like such a crazy, freak thing that happened to you. I mean, like you said, it's 1 in 2 million people that this would happen to, or 2 million cases. Yeah, that's crazy.
1 in 2 million. And that's the thing, for a long time, I was so aware that it was such a freak thing that happened that I thought nobody would understand how I felt about it. But, and we're going to get into this later and why I do the work that I do now, one of the enormous revelations that I learned, very late in my journey, is that we're all completely unique in our trauma, and we are completely individual in our healing process. But in between, in that space of symptoms and the aftermath, We are completely universal. And it makes absolutely zero difference what the actual trauma was. We as survivors have a meta language to understand each other, because you and I, we have totally different experiences. But when I say I was depressed, or when I say I was fearful or anxious, or I had insomnia, I bet you understand the depth that that relates to.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's why I bring people on the show who've been through different types of traumatic experiences growing up, because it doesn't matter, you know, if it's in, you know, a medical situation like yours, or someone was sexually abused or physically abused or bullied or what have you. I mean, we all, you know, are affected in very similar ways. You know, we can all experience PTSD from what we've gone through.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And that's one of the biggest things. You know, I do a lot of speaking, keynote speeches and workshops and that kind of thing. And I always start with trauma education, because we need to level the playing field and get everyone to understand at the base what trauma really is. And from a clinical perspective, trauma is any experience that feels less than good. Now, when you put it that way, is there anyone on this planet that has not had some kind of trauma?
Yeah, not likely, right?
No. And so I think it's so important to start there as a way to validate what everybody is feeling, because I literally have worked with survivors who have had horrific traumas, and yet they will literally sit there and say to me, well, I didn't serve in Iraq, so I must not have really had trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so important to understand and appreciate and to honor and to respect. If it felt traumatic to you, that's really all that mattered. We don't have to compare ourselves to each other. Trauma is trauma.
Absolutely. And you don't want to be minimizing it either.
That's right.
You know, it's, if it happened to you, you know, it's important to you and it's affecting you, and it, you know, you deserve to be able to heal from that, you know?
Exactly.
So,
100%. I agree
mhm.
with you.
So obviously, you know, what you went through was very traumatic, and, you know, share with us the ways in which it impacted your life.
Oh boy. All right. How much time do we have? Okay. So, well, right off the bat, it made me, it made me completely avoidant. So before I even left the hospital, my mom at that time, I mean, she's still my mom, but at that time, my mother was very prescient in understanding the psychological impact of trauma. And she had no training in trauma, but she insisted that a psychiatrist come speak with me before I left the hospital. And I literally, in my mind, the picture that came to mind when I was asked to talk about what had happened to me was, you're going to have to put me into a straitjacket in a padded cell and lock the door, because I don't think I can't handle the way this is making me feel. And so I immediately became completely avoidant of all things related to my trauma. And if anyone brought it up, I would burst into a rage. I mean, a screaming, shouting, foot stomping, shut it down kind of rage. So that was my first issue.
Hmm.
My second issue was a complete insomniac. I could not sleep. I couldn't unwind enough to go to sleep, and if I fell asleep, then I couldn't stay asleep. And eventually, as the years went by, I slept at the worst of my post-traumatic stress disorder. I slept 1 hour a night, which is exhausting.
Wow.
And you know, if you don't sleep, your brain doesn't work right. You don't eat right. You eat all kinds of crap just trying to stay awake, but then all of that crap impacts your body because your body's not healthy. So everything sort of spirals out of control in that sense. I ended up with a very distorted belief system about myself, others, and the world. And it's on those three levels that trauma always affects us. And so this is going to sound so bizarre, but just bear with me. During the near-death experience that I had, I wanted to die. What I had been living through in that hospital room was torture, and I was glad that I was going to be released from it. My mother called me back, and my guilt over leaving when she didn't want me to go brought me back. But I really wanted to die. And so when I came back and tried to reassimilate myself into a regular lifestyle, I really struggled with survivor's guilt. I felt I didn't deserve to be alive because I had wanted to die. So this is just a simple example of how trauma affects our belief systems, and it gets, then it gets worse from there, because then what happens to someone when they don't believe they deserve to be alive? How do they treat themselves? What do they think about themselves? How do they let others treat them? What do they let others say to or about them? You have zero self-worth, you have zero self-esteem, zero self-confidence. So, it's that one little belief of not believing I deserve to be alive based on one little distorted trauma thought that led me to anorexia, bad relationships, self-destructive behaviors. So the effects of this trauma were varied and long lasting, and impaired my ability to have relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, and impaired my ability to build a life that worked. Because the one thing I was able to do, I put all of my focus and energy into education. Because if I could get lost in studying, then I could stop feeling what was going on in my body. I could stop thinking about what was going on in my mind. And so I focused on education. But then once I got out of the very structured educational system, I had no way to structure my life because I couldn't manage my life.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, the inability to build a career, the inability to stay at any job because I was constantly having meltdowns, moving to New York City, moving back to where my parents lived, moving back to New York City, back to where my parents lived. This went on through my 20s and my 30s because I couldn't function as a normal human being for any length of time. So those are just, the bottom line of the effects of how trauma can be so deep in your psyche, and they affect your behavior. And then I had a slew of physical ailments because the stress on your body takes its toll. So digestive issues, skin issues, liver issues. And I'm not a drinker. I've never done drugs. My whole trauma stemmed from what happened when a chemical altered my body. So I was terrified of all that stuff. But still, I had all of these problems with organs that nobody could explain. That, by the way, all cleared up the minute I healed my mind.
That's
Power,
amazing.
yeah, power is pretty incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, when you have, the negative belief that you had, and you have that survivor's guilt, I mean, that sort of thing, until you kind of become aware of that and change that belief, um, that is so powerful, right? That just kind of like, it's there through everything that you're doing, and it's going to be subconsciously sabotaging yourself because you don't feel like you're worthy or deserving of any of these things in your life, right?
Absolutely. Melissa, that's it. That's it. In a nutshell, that is the problem. So, for example, I found myself living with a man who was extraordinarily verbally and emotionally abusive. But in my distorted world, I didn't deserve anything more than that. I didn't deserve anything better than that because I didn't really deserve to be alive anyway. And I had to, extricate myself when things escalated. And really, it was a wake-up call, I'll tell you that, to realize that because I so devalued myself, I'd found myself in this situation that was so harmful to me. And it really was an interesting place to be if you are open to self-awareness, to start being curious about the moments that you find yourself in, and to say, how did I get here and how have I contributed to my getting here? And it was a real moment for me to realize, well, he basically treats me the way I treat me. It's just he's on the outside of my head and I'm on the inside. So
And for
so
as
it
long as you feel that way, for as long as you feel unworthy and undeserving
mm,
of more, you're not going to do anything differently.
that's very true. And that's it, right? You have to have the self-awareness and then make the choice and take the action that leads to change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because none of this stuff changes itself, unfortunately.
Right.
For a long time, I was like, when I finally did get into therapy, I just thought, well, I'm just going to show up every Monday at 6 o'clock. And my therapist's name was Greg. Greg will do the work. And then I'll go home and I don't have to do anything until next Monday at 6 o'clock. And that was, I look back at that version of myself and I say, oh, you poor little girl. You were 30 and you didn't understand that you needed to participate because it's not going to be fixed from the outside. It gets fixed from the inside and you're the only one in there.
Mm-hmm. So when did things start to shift for you? When did you start to really do your healing work?
I started to really do my healing work. Well, I started and then I stopped and then I started again. So we'll go with the first time. Every time I did healing work, it was because I was in a crisis that terrified me more than the thought of having to do healing work. So do you know what I mean when I say that? Because thinking about doing healing work is scary. Like, I'm going to have to go there. I'm going to have to think about this stuff. I don't think I can handle those feelings or those memories. And the fear of that was really potent and stopped me from getting help for decades.
Mm-hmm.
When I finally went to therapy, it was because my body had deteriorated to such a point that I had a complete and total medical meltdown. And I had chronic fatigue syndrome, and I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and I was bedridden, and things were pretty dire. And it was at that point that my mother said to me, how about now? Do you think now would be a good time for therapy?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you what, Melissa, the only reason I said yes was because I thought I was going to go to therapy to learn how to be a chronic patient, to talk to someone about what it meant to live the life that I was living and had been living for a really long time. That I was just always sick and having these meltdowns and these breakdowns. I didn't think I was going into trauma therapy. So that was a big surprise to me. But
Mm-hmm.
that is, it's interesting because none of us go to therapy for the real problem. We go to therapy for a problem we think we can handle. And then once we get there, we drop down to what the real problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that all the time in my practice. Today, someone will come in, for example, because they were raped. But when we really get into the work, they were abused sexually as a little girl. And so we have to start the healing of all of it, not just part of it. And for me, that was the same. Like, I went into therapy because I just felt overwhelmed by the medical issues that I was struggling with. But the real thing I needed help with was what was driving all of those medical issues, which was the original trauma itself.
Yeah. And I think that, we don't deal with it right away because it's scary for us. And, there can be a lot of shame involved with it too. And so until we get to that place where it's more painful, to stay where we are, we don't do anything differently. We don't face it.
Yes, you're so right. And that's it, right? It's that rock bottom moment. And I had two. And each time, because of course, each time they pushed me into a deeper level of therapy. So the first time I was just completely medically miserable and frightened and terrified and triggered because nobody could understand what was going wrong with my body. So it was like a different scenario, but the same trauma, right? Something's wrong. My body is imploding and nobody can help me. I'm going to die. That was all I kept thinking is I'm going to die. I was down to 100 pounds. Nobody could help me. I couldn't eat anything. I was a mess. And I just kept thinking, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And so therapy was a better alternative than sitting at the house thinking that. But then therapy started to work, and within 6 months, I was more myself, and I was able to handle things. And in 2 years, I had spent a lot of time healing my body and in therapy, and I fired my therapist because I was fine. Now I'm good, right? It took 17 years before I started therapy the first time, and that was the first time I had ever talked about my trauma. So I was so pleased with myself. Look, I don't need you anymore. I can talk about it. I'm fine. I'm physically better. I'll see you later. And I went off to do my thing. And, you know, I don't think that lasted more than 2.5 years before I was right back in his office because everything was falling apart because I had not healed what was really at the core. And it was another medical complete terror because I was diagnosed in my mid-30s with advanced osteoporosis. And this doctor said to me, if you do not fix this, your bones will start to spontaneously combust and crumble
Wow.
within 10 years. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to like go to the subway and fall down the stairs because my shin bone is just going to crumble. This is terrifying. So I went back to therapy, but here's the breakthrough of that second time. I was more open and I was very clear that everything about me was driven by fear. I was terrified from the moment I woke up in the morning until the moment I went to bed. And even that 1 hour that I slept was not fear-free because I had the same recurring nightmare over and over and over related to my trauma. So I went back to therapy, but that time I was very intentional. I understood I'm being driven by this stuff, and there is a big fear that is pushing me in every moment, and it has got to stop. And that was the first time that I committed to therapy. So the first round of therapy I went, but I wasn't committed. The second time I went and I was committed to figure this out. And that's when things started to change. That's when I really started to do the work that eventually led me to where I am today, which is 100% free of all symptoms. I've been in triggering situations. I'm totally fine. So it is possible to go from, you know, the very deepest depths of despair and fear to this place of the highest light and joyfulness and happiness and safety. It's a process that each one of us has coded in us. We just have to figure out what that process is because it doesn't come with a map.
Right. Right. And it's going to be different for all of us.
Exactly.
You know, we all have to find out what works for us. But tell us, you know, a little bit more about that. You know, what did that journey with that process look like for you to get you to where you know, are 100% free of your symptoms?
Right. So let's say it started in my mid-20s with that first round. I feel that even when we feel like therapy has been a failure, because certainly when I started my second round of therapy, wasn't I shocked to be back there? Because I had been so sure when I fired Greg that I was done. So I feel like everything accumulates and you just don't necessarily know. But everything you do is like putting money in the healing bank, and you don't know how much money you deposit every time, but it's in there. So the first round, I did a lot of talk therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and I did acupuncture and emotional freedom technique and thought field therapy and tappus acupuncture technique and EMDR. I literally was telling one of my clients this story the other day just to give them a sort of sense of what healing could look like. And it's like I did the alphabet. I did EMDR, EFT, TFT, TAT. Like you could just keep going.
Well, isn't it great that we have all those different modalities available to us?
It's the best because, like you said, we all have to find our individual path. And so you just have to keep banging around until you find the thing that lights your way. And each of those things, with the exception of one, each of those things led me forward somewhat. But I was not free of symptoms. So even looking back, I know when I ended that first round of therapy, if you had asked me to be super honest, and if I'd been willing to be honest, I could have told you that for the last 6 months of that first round of therapy, I was pretty much just talking about nothing because I didn't want to go into the rest. And that was fine because sometimes you need to take a break. You know, it's a lot to process, and sometimes you need to just take a break and let your mind play with and your body play with the concepts and the process and how it feels, and that's okay. So part of the healing that I did was that first round, but the second round, I did things differently. I was very intentional. I did a lot of my own research. I understood what needed to be healed, and so I started really focusing on the fear that was at the core of everything, instead of talking about why me, or how could this have happened, or telling my story, or avoiding telling my story. I really went full force into the fear that was at the bottom of the story, because it was the fear that I had always tried to stay as far away from as I could, because it was that made me feel so overwhelmed. So the second round, I went right into the fear, and I went to therapy twice a week, sometimes for 2 hours at a time, because I just wanted to get it done. And then what happened, and I see this a lot because, over the past decade, I've worked with a lot of survivors, and I lead a huge community of survivors. So I get a lot of feedback. It's awesome to hear what's similar in all of us. And talking about it that much, it led me into a complete and utter meltdown. I mean, literally, I had to quit my job again because it just was too much at once. And so here's what I learned from that. I learned to pace myself in recovery, and I learned what was really bothering me about the fear and the overwhelm of it was how out of control and unsafe I felt, which you probably already know this, but back then I didn't know this because this was, like late 90s, early 2000s. I didn't realize how much, just as survivors, we need a sense of safety and control.
Mm-hmm.
I knew my behaviors were weird, but I didn't know that's what I was trying to do for myself.
Yeah, because we didn't have that when we were going through whatever it was we were going through.
Right.
That's what was taken away from us.
That's right. So what I decided was that talk therapy I was done with, because it was clearly leading me into a much worse place. And so I quit. But I didn't quit therapy. I didn't quit healing. I just quit talk therapy. And what I did was start going and researching what are the alternative modalities that will allow me to get this work done without talking about it, thinking about it, or remembering it, because I've already done all that and it's not helping. And so here's the first thing I did, because I'm an education junkie. I read everything I could about trauma and healing, trauma psychology, trauma, everything. I researched everything from the late 1800s, which is when trauma psychology really developed as a field, all the way to today. So that was the first thing I did. Then when I had a grip on that, I decided, okay, I get it. I have to, go in and sort of reprogram how my mind and my body are holding on to all of this. And that's when I decided I didn't know what the heck to do. So I just sort of had another meltdown. And when that meltdown was over, and here's where that meltdown was, it was New Year's Eve, and I was at a big hotel with my family, and there was this huge party going on, and everybody's dancing and dressed up and eating and having this great time. And where am I? I'm in the bathroom in a stall, sobbing my eyes out, because another year is ending and I am still really messed up, and it's my late 30s now. And where is my life going to be if I stay on this track? But I have no clue what to do to heal. And I'm now facing going into another year that's going to be just as bad as the one that's ending. And I just cried and cried and cried and cried. And then eventually, because you can only do that for so long, I pulled myself back together and I went back out to the party and I grabbed my brother's hand and I said to him, look, I need to dance, just get on the dance floor with me. I just felt in my body I needed to move. And this is the turning point for my entire recovery, because on that dance floor, something bizarre happened. I don't know how it happened. I don't know why it happened. I don't know what brought it on in that moment. But all of a sudden, while we were dancing, and I wish I could remember the song because I can't even remember that. But while we were dancing, and it was just like freestyle dancing, so, whatever that looks like to everybody. But all of a sudden, I realized that I felt light and I felt happy and I felt transcendent. Like I was just sort of floating. And I don't mean that in like a frightening way. I really just felt good. And as I started to check in with myself, how is it possible? I could be sobbing my eyes out 15 minutes ago and now I'm feeling this good. What is this? And I kept thinking, what am I feeling? What am I feeling? It was such a bizarre feeling. And it took me maybe 20 minutes of dancing to realize what I was feeling was joy.
Mm.
I felt amazing on the dance floor. My body felt great. I felt infused with this incredible energy. It just felt awesome. And it occurred to me, oh my God, I never thought I could feel this way. I only thought I could feel the way I felt in the bathroom. But now I'm learning that I'm capable of something else. And that was an eye-opener to me.
Oh, that must have given you a lot of hope.
It really did. And you know what it also did? It gave me a vision for healing
Mm-hmm.
because I wanted to feel more of that. And so, you know, everybody makes New Year's resolutions. I made two. Number one, I vowed I was going to kick PTSD that year by the end of the year. So I had 365 days to do it. And I vowed I was going to dance every day. No matter how I felt, no matter how depressed I was, no matter how tired I was going to dance.
Nice. And
Now,
when was this?
this was 2006.
Okay.
So I had just recently moved to a small beach town from New York City. And so like in my New York City mind, I'm like, oh yeah, I can go dancing every night. There's clubs open every night. And then you come back to reality and you're like, you're in a tiny little dance town. There is no club. So I had to figure out, how am I going to do this? And I literally signed up for dance classes at dance studios all over my county every night of the week. So Monday night was East Coast swing. Tuesday night was salsa. Wednesday night was West Coast swing and cha-cha. Thursday night was Argentine tango. I mean, like every day had a different class schedule, and I went. Regardless of whether or not I wanted to go, I went just in quest of that 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 2 hours. It got longer and longer every time. That feeling of being, I knew who I was. I was not that shell of a woman who was in despair and full of symptoms. There was this other part of me that came out on a dance floor that I loved her. And I needed to connect with her over and over again. Well, here's what happened. I did no treatment for trauma. For 6 months, I just danced every single day. I started to sleep better. My nightmare had a very interesting progression. It went from me being a victim to me being an equal to me being a victor. It was very weird. Like on another day, I'll tell you that story. But it was very interesting to watch how my dreams changed. The more I got in touch with how good it could feel to be me and where my power was on the dance floor in terms of knowing who I was and how I was showing up and making that choice, I started to eat better. I started to have days where I wasn't so depressed until there were days that I wasn't depressed at all for the whole day. I just may have been neutral. It wasn't like I was joyful all day, but I wasn't like, you know, wanting to curl up into a ball. And this gave me courage. So after 6 months of this, I had the courage to say, okay, I know there's more healing work to do around the trauma. And I think if I keep dancing and I do the trauma work at the same time, I think I can handle it. And I did more research and I found modalities where you didn't have to talk about it and you didn't have to think about it and you didn't have to relive it. Hypnosis was one of them. Neurolinguistic programming was another. And I went and I found practitioners that used those modalities. And by October 16th that year, I was done. I was 100% symptom free, and I have remained that way since then.
Oh, that's incredible.
So it can happen. It really can happen when we get, and here's the thing though, and this is why we all have this potential. What's the real thing that I did? It's not the dancing, because you don't have to dance to feel good about who you are or connect with like something that makes you feel good about being alive. Everybody has different things. I challenge every single one of the clients that I work with, find the thing that is your dance. And some of them, you know, I live in Florida, so I have one client who just loves to ride wave runners, and he'll just go out on a wave runner on the ocean for hours because that's the place that he feels good. I have other clients who choose other things. So it's not the activity, it's the idea of finding a way to connect to what it means to feel good about being alive. And that's the thing that trauma takes from us. It doesn't feel good to be alive. But healing is the place that we take that back. And at the bottom of it all is the desire. Because if you do not have an unending desire to feel better, you will not heal. But if you have a desire to feel better, you will keep going until you figure out what unlocks that victory for you.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love how you found something that made you feel good, that gave you that joy in your life again, and you latched onto that, and you used that for your healing.
That's right. And joy is energy. And if we need anything in healing, it's energy. It's the thing that is so draining to pull all of ourselves back. You know, trauma fragments us. We splinter into so many different pieces, and healing is really about calling all of those pieces back and putting back a whole person. I have this client, one of my first clients. So this is like 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And I still have this because by the time we were done, she was a quilter. And she sent me, for our bed, she sent me king size quilt that she had made while we were working on her recovery. And she sent me this beautiful letter about that healing trauma is like making a quilt. It's taking all of these scraps that look like they don't belong together and putting them together in an organized way that makes a piece of art. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant, because she's right. It's pulling back the scraps of ourselves and organizing them in a way that it's beautiful and it's meaningful and it lasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so great. And what I love about your story too is that you could have given up anywhere along the way. I mean, after what you had gone through and how you were struggling with your PTSD, you could have very easily given up and said, you know what, I don't want to do this healing work anymore. I'm just going to settle for the way things are. And you didn't do that. You kept fighting, you kept pushing, and you were very intentional. And that is what has, allowed you to get to where you are now.
That's very true. And thank you for bringing that up, because we also should say it's not like I had every day feeling like, oh, I'm being so successful at this. I felt like crap a lot of those healing days, a lot of them. Just because I could access joy on a dance floor did not mean I was joyful all day. There were a lot of days that I would just cry and cry and cry because I was afraid I wasn't going to get to the end. I wanted it so badly, but I didn't know how I was going to make it happen. So I wasn't really full of belief that it could happen. I just was going on a desire. And there were days that I would cry and cry and cry to my mother saying, I'm never going to be free. No matter what I do, I don't get the results that I'm looking for. So it's important to understand that my story is a lovely story. But it's just like when you go to a movie, you only get to see 2 hours of the movie, right? And so they leave out a lot of scenes because they can only hit the high points. And that's what we're doing here. So let's make the point and be really clear that healing sucks. It hurts, it's hard, and we have to face stuff that we have run as fast as we can just to try to avoid. That having been said, we are strong enough to do it. We are survivors. If we survive the very first thing that was traumatizing to us, then we have what it takes to survive healing.
Absolutely.
We have it. There are days that it may feel worse than my original trauma, just in a different way. So it's important, it's just important for us all to understand that healing can hurt. There are ways to make it easier. And when the further I got into those qualities, the easier it became, because I could stop all the painful parts. And we could just work on reprogramming with all of it. But I journey, and whatever that looks like is what it's supposed to be like. And certainly I could look back and say, wow, I lost almost 30 years, and I wish that's not fair. And it's not fair, but it's what it was. And it led me to who I am today and the good work that I'm doing. And I choose just to stand in the place of this is what is, and I'm grateful for where I am. And I think every single one of us can get to that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for bringing that up about, how, healing is difficult, and it's not going to be joyful every day, even if you have those moments of joy. Because I think it's important for anyone listening to understand that, if you are doing your healing work right now and it's a struggle at times, like that's okay. That's normal. Don't feel like you're doing anything wrong or you're failing.
Exactly. Exactly. Because I'll be honest with you, you know what? Sometimes, quote unquote, failure is exactly the thing that leads to your breakthrough.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you a great example of that. Before I went to hypnosis, I was trying all kinds of things and nothing was working. Nothing was working. And I was, have you ever watched When Harry Met Sally?
A long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, so a really long time ago. But there's this scene in there when Sally is just so despondent, and she's going to be 40, and Billy Crystal says to her, "When?" And she says, "Someday." But I really was staring down 40 and a mess. And I remember that was like I really was sure I was failing in my mission to heal. And that was the day that I thought, okay, I'm gonna do something out of the box. I'm gonna go do hypnosis, as I don't even believe in hypnosis, but I think I'm failing at all the other stuff I'm doing, and I'm going to try something completely new. So sometimes it's the failure that leads to the breakthrough, because I'll tell you what, after that first hypnosis session, I slept 8 solid hours that night with 0 nightmares. So we have to sort of go easy on ourselves when we think we're failing, because it may just be the thing that's leading us to success.
Mm, absolutely. Go easy on yourselves and don't give up. That's what I'm hearing. Don't give up. Keep pushing for it. If you have that desire to heal and get better, keep pushing for it. It's worth it and you can get there.
It is, because what's the alternative? The alternative is accepting a life that's less than it could be, and
Mm-hmm.
accepting ourselves as less than we could be. And that's a tragedy. That's adding trauma to trauma. We've already done the hardest thing, which is to survive the original trauma. We deserve more than a life of symptoms.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you're doing really well today, Michele. And tell us about what it is that you do today.
That's such a great question, and I'm so happy to answer it because after we spend so much time on the hard part, I think it's really great to get to a place where things are better, things are easier, things are fun. So I came out of my recovery and I was 40, and I had absolutely no clue what to do with myself, because suddenly the world was in Technicolor, whereas I'd been living in black and white. And suddenly I didn't have to manage symptoms, so I was full of energy and clarity, zero brain fog, fully focused, all this concentration and all this creativity, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I've been a writer since I was 7, so that was 6 years earlier than my trauma. And my brother said to me, "You've always been a writer. You don't know what to do with yourself right now. Why don't you just try this new thing? It's called a blog." So I was like, "A blog? What's that?" So he said, "Well, you just sort of like you get online and you just write stuff." I said, "Well, okay, I could probably do that." And I don't, I'm much older than you, so I don't know if you remember Blogspot, but I started on Blogspot, and I started just blogging about my recovery and what it was like to live with PTSD for all those years. And I literally thought that because my trauma was so rare, nobody would understand what I was talking about. And here's the thing that utterly shocked me. Within 3 weeks, the blog was full of comments. The first ones came in from veterans writing to me, "How do you know exactly how I feel?" Or, "You just put into words what I've been trying to say for 15 years. How did you do that?" And I started writing back to them, "I have no idea. I don't know how you feel. I'm just writing how I feel." And the next thing I knew, I was getting emails from rape survivors, child abuse, domestic violence, car accidents. Everyone ended up on that blog. And suddenly I understood we were all the same. And from there, people wanted more information because what I really started doing, I was the first civilian blog to define PTSD in layman's terms and start talking about what it meant to live that way. And it became Heal My PTSD, healmyptsd.com. And I built this whole site, which still exists today and is enormous now, because what I started doing was inviting survivors who were healing to write for the blog, share what they were doing that was working. I went to all of the top experts. So if you're reading Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Judith Herman, Francine Shapiro, all of the top experts, I went to them and I said, write for my blog and come on my podcast. Let's tell people it's possible to heal. And they did. So one thing led to another, and people then, the site got bigger and bigger and gained more and more attention, and people started asking me to help them, at which point I decided I needed to get trained. So I got trained in modalities that were most useful to me. I'm a certified professional coach with a specialty in trauma. I am a master neurolinguistic programmer, which means I use language to reprogram the actual neural structure. So this is science, the neural structure of the brain, so that we can change how the brain is encoding trauma. And I got trained in hypnosis so that I could help people the way I like being helped, which is you can stop talking about it. Actually, it would be better for you if you would stop talking about it and let's just fix it. So that's what I do all these years later. That's what I do now is I speak. I've written 3 books about trauma and recovery. And I work privately with clients, and I do workshops, and I work with groups, and I'm on this mission to help people heal faster than I did, which pretty much I believe everyone can. Even if you have had trauma for a long time. So that client that I told you about with the quilt, she had been severely traumatized at the age of 2. When I started working with her, she was 50. And I kid you not, I still get email from her telling me what she's up to today and how excited she is that we got her life back because she's well. So not only can you heal after all those years, you can hold on to the gains. She's done it. I've done it. We're not alone. So, and also on the healmyptsd.com website are archives of all of those podcasts of all of these experts talking about how to get it done. So I think the rest of my life, Melissa, is always going to be defined by wanting to raise awareness for PTSD and trauma, to talk about healing and how possible it is, and to lead the way in helping people discover for themselves what that unique process is for them. Because I think that trauma takes a lot from us. And I also think that we can choose to take it back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love it. And, you're doing such great work, and you're making a difference in the lives of so many people. So that's just incredible, that you've been able to do, your work to get to a better place in your life and be able to give back to others. So that is awesome. And I have one final question that I want to ask you today, Michele. And that is, given what you know now, if you could go back to when you were going through your tough times and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
I know that I'm supposed to have an answer already for this, but there's something at the bottom of this conversation that I really want to get to, and I think this is the right moment for it. The thing that I would tell that me is that, I'll say it and then I'll explain what I mean. You're still in there. In that you are in there. I felt so lost and disconnected from any sense of who I was in any good way. And it was sort of like trauma had just dumped all of this garbage on me, and I was under an avalanche of it. And I really thought that who I was, like the real me, because trauma distorted me so much in those beliefs and behaviors and all of that. I really didn't think that the true, real, pure me still existed. But she does. that's what dance led me to, is a little bit reconnecting to joy, is reconnecting to our who. And what I mean by our who, it's the who we really feel we are and who we really feel we want to be and how we fully express who we are. Because trauma requires us so often to wear a mask so that we don't fully reveal ourselves to the world. We don't want to be seen or heard, or if we try to be, we're disrespected for it. So I would tell that part of me, you're still in there. The real you is still in there. So just hang on to her and follow her. And when she gives you guidance, take it, because she will lead you out of here. Because I think it's getting back to that core essence of our true selves, our real selves, our purest, undistorted selves. That's where recovery ends up. When we feel really good about who we are and what it means to be alive, and we feel connected to a sense of what's good about who we are and what we have to offer, and a feeling of more than rather than less than in any moment. That's what I would tell her, that you're still in there. So just figure out a way to claw your way through all the garbage and get back out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Did that make any sense? Because
Yeah,
it's
no.
like hard to put it into language.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. And I think that that's what healing is really all about. It's finding our way back to who we really are, without the trauma impacting that, and it's not to say that it's about erasing that trauma from our lives. That's part of, our story and what we've gone through. It's just getting to a place where it's not impacting us and holding us back anymore and keeping us from being who we truly are capable of.
That's so eloquent. Why couldn't I have said it that way? And it's also not about trying to get back to who you were before.
Mm,
Because for all of us who were childhood trauma survivors, there is no before, right? We're too young to have had a real before. We
hmm
don't know. Identity gets defined between 13 and 18 years of age. If we're traumatized any time before that or during that, trauma becomes a part of who we are on the surface. And trauma will always be something that we remember, but it doesn't have to be the thing that defines us or the thing that is where we lead from. So we don't try to go back ever. We try to go forward. And instead of saying, why me, we say, what now? What now? I just always kept asking myself that. I still ask myself that because I think it's a good way to live, because it keeps you focused on your power. You have the choice. You have the action. You keep asking yourself, what now? And it keeps moving you forward one step at a time. And that's all you really need, is to just keep moving forward one step at a time.
That's it. One step at a time. So, Michele, before we wrap things up and I let you go, what is the best way for people to connect with you or find out about everything you have going on?
So I would say come visit me at mytraumacoach.com. And from there's access to free supporting resources and all the different things that I'm doing in the different ways that I have a free virtual support group, so you can sign up for it right there on mytraumacoach.com. I spend every month, I get on the line with survivors everywhere, and I take live questions. I do live coaching. I take questions during, if you don't want to be live with me, but you have a question that you want to ask, just shoot me an email, or you can put it into the chat while we're live, because I feel like we need to come together. And so I invite everybody to be on the virtual support group. It's free, so all you need is your phone or your computer. And I also, if anybody's local, I do a free monthly support group here in my hometown as well. So access to all of that is at mytraumacoach.com.
All right, that sounds great. I'll have that linked up and have your books linked up as well. So, Michele, I just want to thank you for coming on here today and for sharing your journey with us. I think it's so inspiring and it's so hopeful. And, I love how, we talk so much about healing and how it's possible for anyone. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you so much, and keep doing the great work that you're doing. I admire it and I support it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
You as well.
Thanks for listening to the show today. This has been the Grass Gets Greener podcast, episode 147. Go to thegrassgetsgreener.com/Michele R, and that's Michelle with one L, to find the links mentioned during this episode or to leave a comment. So I hope you enjoyed this episode with Michelle today, and that it has given you hope for your situation and has allowed you to see that you too can conquer PTSD and take your life back and reconnect to who you truly are. Healing isn't fun and it isn't easy, but it is possible and it is worth it. And just remember that even if you're doing the work and you still struggle at times, that's okay. The important thing is to not give up. There are so many things you can try in your healing journey, so keep trying different things until you find what works for you. And be sure to come back for the next episode for more inspiration. And also, if you haven't checked it out yet, over on the website you can find my free 5-day self-esteem challenge that I recently released. It's designed to help you build your confidence so that you can start feeling worthy and good about yourself again. It's something I'm really excited to offer to you and to have you check out. So you can find that at thegrassgetsgreener.com/self-esteem. And lastly, don't forget to head over to iTunes or Stitcher to leave the show a rating and review so that we can reach as many survivors as possible. And, as always, have hope.